Well, the PlayStation 5 is here, we've got ray tracing, and we've seen the generational shift in graphics. But how does it compare with a GeForce? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanks, a graphics comparison with the PlayStation 5 versus the RTX 3080. Now, just as a really quick disclaimer, we want people to understand that we're talking about the PlayStation 5, which is either $400 or $500 for a self-contained console system, and the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3080, which costs around $1,300 just for the graphics card. In all honesty, yes, the NVIDIA is probably capable of more, but the reason we're looking at this isn't necessarily full capability, but rather value. Ultimately, it's up to you and how much money is in your bank account to determine what you want. And without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off at number 5, it's Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is just a really technically impressive game that's actually pretty light on next-gen features, considering how amazing it really looks. Like, this game really mostly gets by on polish. There isn't really a drastic difference between the PS5 and the RTX 3080 here. This game doesn't even have ray tracing effects, and there aren't really any built-in roadblocks to a decent frame rate on consoles with this game at least. This shouldn't really be too much of a surprise, but the game does look very good on PC, and in my experience, runs extremely well too, staying well above 60 frames per second with maxed out settings and never dipping below that mark. Yeah, there are a couple of weird graphical things here and there, mostly the sort of thing you'd expect from an open world game, but for the most part, it looks really good. And that's even without a lot of the really fancy effects, like I said, that a lot of games are incorporating lately. Likewise, the PlayStation 5 version looks really good as well. Like, honestly, it's almost hard to tell the versions apart. Valhalla on the PS5 has effects that don't look quite as sharp, and textures look maybe a little less detailed, but you'd really only be able to tell the difference between a maxed out PC version and the PS5 version if you looked at them side by side. Like we said in the disclaimer, of course, the 3080 wins, but it's a relatively minor difference compared to how much better the previous generation's Assassin's Creed looked on PC and compared to the PS4 and Xbox One. Like, this generation, it's looking pretty close. At number 4 is Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Unlike Valhalla, this game does contain a bunch of the impressive ray tracing features like sun shadows, a local light score ray tracing, as well as ray trace ambient occlusion. On PS5, ray tracing at 4K slows the game down bad, but it's not something I'd want to play multiplayer with enabled anyway. Like, even the campaign seems to struggle at certain points with ray tracing turned on. With it turned off, game runs great at 4K. It's not the most beautiful game. I think the Modern Warfare reboot actually looked better than this year's model in most respects, but the game's not ugly. It's just not using that fancy new engine they built for the last game and are instead back to the old Call of Duty engine they've always used. Like I said, far from ugly, but it's missing a lot of the subtler effects we saw in Modern Warfare. And keep in mind, there's different developers making these games, so you get the point. On PC with an RTX 3080, it is relatively easy to keep the game above 60 frames per second with all settings maxed out at 4K. At certain maps, you'll see it drop a bit, mostly in maps with a lot of reflections like Moscow. But for the most part, the game really just doesn't struggle. It stays above 60. I will say a noticeable thing I saw on PC compared to the PS5 version is that there are a few noticeable visual glitches or weird effects or something. There seems to be an issue with ray traced illumination. Sometimes the effect can look a little ugly and fuzzy. I'm not sure if it's an issue on my end or what, but it is also not something I saw like a lot of. All in all, Cold War has a much more drastic difference between the PC and the PS5. With ray tracing effects turned on, the difference is just incredibly noticeable. The PS5 just struggles to keep it above 30, and on PC it can go well above 60. And that really all comes down to DLSS. PCs have it, consoles don't, and that's just gonna be an inherent limitation. At number 3 is Watch Dogs Legion. Now, this should be an interesting one. Watch Dogs Legion had a really bumpy PC launch. The game struggled to maintain even a solid 60 frames per second with ray tracing turned on, and that's not counting the bugs that, well, lots of people have had the right to complain about, frankly. A few performance patches later, the game's definitely more stable, but there are still a number of issues. This game does not perform as good as it should, and especially on PC, like, let's just say that. And technically speaking, the game's impressive. It's got full ray tracing enabled and DLSS to make it all possible. Still, when it's raining or you're in a particularly reflective section of the city, it's hard to keep the game at a solid frame rate. Combine that with some maddening bugs like the game crashing when you try to close it, then not saving it all, making so you lose hours of progress, and let's just say, game could have been better on PC. Now, does that mean it's better on PS5? Yes and no. Like, it definitely feels a lot more stable. But there's a big issue. You can't turn off ray tracing in this game. So like most games with ray tracing options, it runs not so great 30 frames per second or lower when you're playing in 4K. Maybe we've been a little spoiled by 60 frames per second, but 30 seems pretty sluggish, even though the ray tracing is pretty impressive. I mean, for a console game. This is one game where the difference between PC and console is really obvious. It's the frame rate. It's just a lot better on PC with a 3080. But if you don't plan on playing the game in 4K or just don't mind 30 frames per second, it really is a technical powerhouse for a console game, given how many reflections and effects are on screen at any given time. And at the moment, it just runs much more stable on console. At number 2, Fortnight on PC has been updated to include next-generation features like ray tracing and DLSS support. The ray tracing effects aren't just for reflections either. Shadows, ambient occlusion, and global illumination are all ray traced, and all this together practically makes this game feel new, at least visually speaking. And because the game was built to run on pretty much anything, it should come as no surprise that playing the game with all the ray tracing effects isn't particularly taxing on a 3080. Like, it looks nice on PC and surprisingly good on console as well. This is one game where I tested with all of the options fully enabled, and it still ran at a playable frame rate on PS5. Like, there is no ray tracing on the PS5. The draw distance is very obviously shorter than on PC. It's actually pretty short no matter what you do, even on PC, but not just for objects. Like, the draw distance is shorter for a lot of effects too, like shadows. It's not like a deal breaker or anything, but it's something I did notice between the two versions. Either way, the fact they were able to take some of these PC features and bring them over to the PS5 without really losing anything is really cool. I mean, keep in mind we are talking about Fortnite, which is by far one of the most simplistic games out there, graphically speaking, that is on any level as popular as it is. But that also kind of makes it a great candidate to be a thing that shows off these types of features. Ultimately, it just looks pretty darn good on both platforms and runs way better than you would expect a game with all of these features turned on. I mean, you better expect this kind of stuff out of top-of-the-line graphics cards, but that's where we are. And finally, at number 1, Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition. This one is a particularly interesting one to compare because though this game is more than a year old at this point, there is a pretty damn big difference between the PC version and the new Special Edition on the PS5. The Special Edition version of this game for PS5, Xbox Series X as well, has basically 3 graphical options. 4K resolution at 30 frames per second, 1080p at 60 frames per second, or no ray tracing at 120 frames per second. It is a great looking game regardless of what option you choose, but I think most players will want to be able to play it at 60 frames per second because it's that kind of game. Now, an annoying thing about the Special Edition on the PS5, Xbox Series X is that it is a separate version, meaning you can't just download the new Special Edition DLC and be able to upgrade your game to next gen. You're just going to have to throw down another $40 if you want to see what this game looks like in 4K with ray tracing effects. Not necessarily super cool, guys. Another annoying thing, PCs aren't getting the next generation effects updates. You'd think they'd just be able to upgrade the PC version with these effects. But Capcom decided not to do that, at least for the time being. Still, in motion, the difference isn't actually all that noticeable. It's not the reflections where the ray tracing effects are most pronounced in this game, it's actually the lights, and they look a lot more dramatic between the updates. Of course, the game still looks fantastic, whether it's PC, PS4, or PS5, but this is one case where a game on PS5 and is cross-platform looks and plays noticeably better on the console rather than the PC with a beefy graphics card. I mean, the main reason that's the case is Capcom doesn't want to put ray tracing on PC, and who really knows exactly why they don't want to do that, but either way it does look better on the PS5, even if the difference may not be immediately noticeable, particularly due to the speed of the game. I'll say this, playing on 1080p on a 4K screen isn't actually that distracting, and the silky smooth frame rate feels so good to have. I mean, it doesn't completely replace last generation's version because the changes, while nice, don't totally revolutionize the game or anything. But the ray trace graphics are really impressive, especially when you're noticing it between bouts of action. Well, that's our observations. How about you? Leave us a comment. Tell us what you think about these different versions between platforms. Do you have experience, or are you just wandering in to see what the deal is? Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on Game Ranks.